Welcome to Mortal Remains, Chapter 2, Nighters. In the Major Crimes Division, MCD, of the Fall River Police Department, the first detectives ever assigned to regular night duty were a couple of young newcomers named Alan Sylvia and Tom Joaquin. To outsiders, including Sylvia and Joaquin, the logic of a night shift was obvious. At least two of the division's detectives would be working the same hours as most of the people they were hired to catch. But the older detectives in the division smiled at the choice. Like their captain, most of them looked down on the newcomers, both on the force only a couple of years, both college educated and still in their middle 20s, before they even met them. The captain and the old-timer saw the nighttime assignment as a way to insulate these two different and potentially troublesome kids from a relatively comfortable status quo, the real life of the division. Their first day on the new job, two incidents occurred that seemed to both Joaquin and Sylvia to be intended to set the tone for their shared future. The first within a few minutes of their arrival, as they stood more or less in attention in Captain Reese's office. The captain looked them over, each in turn, apparently confirming his worst doubts, then nodded slowly and announced in a controlled, nearly conversational voice, "I didn't ask for you. I don't want you here, and as far as I'm concerned, you can each shove your education up your ass." Joachim winced. Sylvia nodded affably and gave a big smile, holding the captain's eye. Reese appeared to recognize that Sylvia was the more dangerous of the two, and he studied him for a moment longer, not in a friendly manner. A few minutes later, Sylvia and Joachim were standing in the hallway trying to figure out how to get organized on their new jobs without an office or even a desk of their own. One of the other detectives, an old-timer who wore the kind of pork pie hat Ed Egan had made famous a few years earlier in The French Connection, watched them for a while and then strolled over. He gripped Sylvia's elbow in the same time-honored way of a street detective when they are about to invite a felon into the patrol car for a trip to the county line. "Hey, kid," he said. "You've got an education. What are you doing hanging around here, anyway?" Sylvia looked at him without knowing what to say, then decided to say nothing. Again, he smiled. The old-timer smiled back, released his grip, and patted Sylvia on the shoulder. Unlike the scene with the captain, Sylvia decided, this wasn't a challenge. It was a friendly warning. Sylvia and Joachim found themselves outside the system that employed them, but they were both intimately familiar with the larger system of the city, with the streets where they would be working, with the people who lived on them. Each had been born in the tough south end of Fall River. Each had gone to school there, Sylvia through the public schools and Durfee High, Joachim through the Catholic parochial schools, and each had come back to Fall River after a term in the military. Alan Sylvia, 3 years older than his partner, graduated from Durfee High in 1970 and enlisted in the Marines. Up to then, he had been a street kid, tough, wise, experienced in the local arts, hanging around corners, sometimes getting into fights, and while still a juvenile, occasionally breaking into houses. One of the reasons he had picked the Marine Corps was because he recognized that it could be a turning point. And it was. He spent 2 years overseas, shuttling back and forth as a message courier to Vietnam. And when he came out, he was ready for a different life. At the time of his assignment with the Major Crimes Division, he was enrolled at Salve Regina College in nearby Newport, Rhode Island, working on a master's degree in human services and management. Tom Joaquim joined the Army as soon as he graduated from high school, served 3 years, and got out in 1974. He was in his second year of college when he joined the police department on the same day as Alan Sylvia in April of 1976. Once on the force, Sylvia served as a uniformed patrolman for 6 months and then became a detective. Joachim was on the streets for 2 years as a patrolman and didn't become a detective until this assignment to the Major Crimes Division. In their first few days on the job, almost no one called the two new men by their names. To their faces, they remained, "Hey kid." When the other detectives, the old-timers, were talking amongst themselves, they referred to them simply as the Nighters. Even if the day force viewed the new shift as a form of exile, Sylvia and Joachim didn't. From the very first, they looked on it as the necessary next step in their careers as detectives, part of the dues to be paid in continuing up a somewhat indefinite ladder. But within just a few days, they both realized the night work was the doorway to something far better. It was the rabbit hole that led to the opportunities they would find nowhere else on the police force, not just for advancement, but for great adventure. More important, they began to get results. While the combined activity of the 9 daytime detectives in the Major Crimes Division might average some 4 or 5 arrests in an entire week, there were times when Sylvia and Joachim would do several times that number in a single night. One morning, Captain Reese arrived at work to find every available room on the second floor of the station house filled with stolen property recovered in a raid the night before. Following a procedure that by then had become routine, he called across the squad room, "Sylvia, come into my office." The daytime crew enjoyed the ritual. It was not uncommon for the sliding windows in the captain's office to rattle with his rage. "Get your ass in here," Reese sputtered as Sylvia got nearer, "and shut the goddamn door." Sylvia obeyed. Through the glass, he looked across the room with exaggerated seriousness at Joachim before turning to face the captain. "Where did all this stuff come from, and how the hell did you get it into the station?" "It's stolen property," Sylvia answered. "We ran a raid last night. I tried to reach you. I left messages at the station. I called your house." "You're gonna make me sick. You're driving me crazy," the captain said. "Gee, we thought you'd be pleased," Sylvia lied. "There's over $250,000 worth of loot here. This is a major—" "God damn it, I asked you how you got it all into the station." "Well," Sylvia said, shrugging, "we rented a U-Haul. That was all we could do." "Oh, shit," the captain said, sitting down as though Sylvia had pushed him. "I can't believe this shit. Where are we getting the money to go around renting U-Hauls?" It wasn't a question that Sylvia could answer because the division was famous for spending almost nothing for outside expenses. The captain got up from his chair and slapped the flat of his hand on the top of his desk. "Where are we getting the money to rent goddamn U-Hauls?" Bang, bang, bang. Sylvia looked behind the captain out into the squad room. The windows were shaking more than usual this morning, and Tom Joachim was pretending to be busy himself at a file cabinet, grinning broadly. The captain's shows of outrage were the nearest thing they ever got to praise. 3 daytime detectives were standing together nearby, and although they were not as open in showing their amusement, they too were taking in the morning show. Sylvia looked thoughtful, pondering the captain's question. "Well," he said after a moment, "one thing we could do. How about a tag sale?" As the two young detectives became more and more successful on the job, their accomplishments began to attract the attention of the news media, a development that further aggravated their relationship with the captain. Reese has always had an attitude toward the press that tended to be adversarial, and now it became commonplace for him to arrive with a newspaper under his arm in the morning, shout for Sylvia to get his goddamn ass into the office, and start berating him about whatever he had heard Sylvia saying on the radio on his way to work. "I read about you in the paper, and now I have to listen to you on the goddamn radio." Sylvia would wait for a break, then try to explain to the captain what he and Joachim had managed to accomplish during their latest shift. During the hours when the captain and all the other detectives in the Major Crime Division were at home with their wives and families, having dinner, watching television, and sleeping through the night. Even when there were no particular surprises awaiting Reese on his arrival at the station in the morning during those first months, he seemed determined that the briefings would be less than cordial. On slow days, he developed a habit of circling in red pencil the typos and spelling errors on their reports, especially Sylvia's, and confronting them, often noisily and at length, with their intellectual failings. Sylvia made an effort at first to be more careful at the typewriter, but after a few weeks he began thinking of these sessions as a relatively benign safety valve for the captain's anger. And there were times when he would plant a deliberate, trivial error, knowing it would explode harmlessly the following morning. A window rattling sneeze that cleared the captain's head and helped them both get on with their work. Almost at the beginning, Sylvia and Joachim noticed a pattern to their difficult relationship with the captain and more generally with the day shift. The better the nighters became at what they did, the greater the problem it often created for them back at the headquarters. Part of it was that they were rocking the boat and they knew it. But as Joachim and Sylvia talked with each other, they also came to recognize that the nature of their cases was very different from those that occupied the detectives in the daytime. During regular business hours, the typical arrest in the Major Crimes Division was for such relatively civilized offenses as larceny by check or money order, and perhaps the odd housebreak. But the nighters got the bright lights and the heavy action, dealing with people who weren't even awake during the day shift. And when some of those night people decided to rob a bar or a convenience store, Sylvia and Joachim were as likely as the patrolmen on the beat to arrive at the scene while the crime was still in progress, while the threats were being made and the violence was being committed by people who used fists, clubs, knives, and guns. But it went beyond the fact that their work was more exciting. The really big distinction was that at night the rules were different. For example, at about 5 o'clock one evening in their second winter on the job, Sylvia and Joachim were just about to leave for a night on the streets when the dispatcher got a call from a travel agency on North Main. A man was attempting to negotiate a forged traveler's check. The call was close to the station house, and the nighters set out at a dead run. When they came within sight of the travel agency, they saw a heavy-set man of about 40 in a tweed overcoat just coming out of the door, looking furtively up and down the street and apparently deciding on which way to make his escape. The two detectives didn't wear uniforms, but it was obvious that the person in the doorway immediately recognized them as police. Rather than running off, he hesitated, then in an elaborate display of innocence, he ambled slowly in the other direction, frantically stuffing a piece of paper into his mouth and chewing vigorously. The detectives caught up and each grabbed him by an arm. Sylvia held his elbow with one hand and clamped his face with the other, trying to force open the jaws. The man wriggled and lowered his head, gagging and gasping for breath, but still chomping as fast as he was able to on the wad of paper. "You swallow that, you son of a bitch, and you're in a lot of trouble," Sylvia said. The big man nodded as though in agreement, his eyes wide with fear and the strain of gagging, but he kept on wriggling and chewing despite Sylvia's pressure on his face. Finally, he swallowed. "Oh, shit," Sylvia said. He could see the muscles in the man's neck stretch tight and the blood vessels bulge as the wad slid down his throat, like a snake enveloping a rat, and then the struggle stopped. "Shit." The suspect's expression was a combination of apology and relief. He grinned sheepishly at the two policemen and then said, "What's the matter, huh? What did you guys want, anyway?" They cuffed his hands behind his back. Joachim recited the suspect's rights, and Sylvia spoke briefly with the manager of the travel agency. Then the two detectives, one on each elbow, walked their truculent prisoner back to the station house. During the short trip, Sylvia glowered but said nothing. Halfway to their destination, Joachim leaned over and said, confidentially and almost in a whisper near the suspect's ear, "I've never seen him so pissed." The prisoner looked at Joachim in alarm and puzzlement, then furtively towards Sylvia on his right, as though assessing him in a new light. In the same low voice, Joachim added, "Just don't make things worse, okay?" He gripped the suspect's elbow more firmly for emphasis. "Okay," he repeated. Obviously on his guard, the suspect made a grudging nod. Nothing was more said until they got to the station house. After the formalities at the desk, the detectives took the man to an interview room. There were 3 straight-backed wooden chairs and a gray steel-case table in the room. And on the table was a heavy ashtray of black lucite. Joachim indicated where the suspect was to sit, on the chair in the middle, and then he moved the ashtray to the other end of the table, away from Sylvia. "I don't want you repeating any mistakes," he said. When Sylvia didn't reply, Joachim explained the remark as he unlocked the prisoner's handcuffs. "My partner here nearly killed a guy with one of these about a month ago. Smashed his face with it, knocked one of his eyes loose, right where you're sitting." He was telling a story about an errant friend. A boys will be boys kind of thing. Good for laughs. Clearly, he was more concerned with keeping his psycho partner out of trouble than he was with the suspect's health or well-being. The man muttered, "Yeah, bullshit," but he avoided eye contact with either of them, keeping his gaze fixed on the ashtray at the end of the table. Sylvia leaned forward, spreading his hands on the cool tabletop, and craned around to put his face in the suspect's line of sight. "The manager of the travel agency says you tried to pass a forged traveler's check for $100. We don't want to waste any more of our time with you. We want a statement right now so we can lock you up and get on with the night's work." The suspect leaned back in the chair and shifted his gaze upward, toward the ceiling. "I didn't try to pass no fucking check in no fucking travel agency. I went in to get a brochure. Period. He doesn't know what he's fucking talking about." Joachim put his hand out protectively, as though to ward off the explosion he feared from Sylvia. "Hey," he said. "Hey, hey, hey." But the attack didn't come. Sylvia remained in the same position, watching the subject like an unblinking, meat-eating bird, not moving a muscle. The man in the overcoat seemed more like a big, bad boy than a felon. He slid down in the chair, still looking at the ceiling, and despite the pressure on either side, it was clear he was trying hard to appear composed or even indifferent as he evaluated his position. No doubt by then he could feel his digestive juices attacking the wad of evidence in his stomach, breaking it down into unreadable pulp. And after a moment more, he smiled the faintest possible smile. "So, what about this check, huh? Where the fuck is it?" Sylvia stood up so abruptly the prisoner flinched. The detective left the room, slamming the door behind him. The suspect was uncertain how to interpret what was happening, and he looked to Joachim for a clue. Joachim just looked back, then shook his head slowly in resignation and regret. Clearly, matters were now out of his hands. A moment later, the door opened again, and Sylvia reappeared. He was carrying a large metal plate, a length of a filthy red hose, and a bucket. Some of the offices in the back of the building were being renovated, and when Joachim looked more closely, he recognized the items in his partner's hands as part of a wallpaper steamer. Sylvia set down the paraphernalia noisily on the metal table. "There's an easy way to do this, and a hard way," he said. "You choose." The big man didn't want to give up any of his earlier advantage, but it was obvious he had no idea what he was looking at, and it made him nervous. Finally, he glanced edgewise at Joachim and asked, "Do what?" As before, Joachim just shook his head, perhaps with even more resignation than a moment earlier. Your choice, he said, imitating his partner. Joachim had no idea what Sylvia had in mind, and he was worried that this might get out of hand. Pump your stomach, asshole, Sylvia said. No, no, you're not, the suspect said. You can't. The smug smile had vanished, and he was in a panic. He struggled to sit upright, but his weight was against him, and his rump kept slipping down, across the seat and out of the chair. Joachim placed a restraining hand on his shoulder, which appeared to be offered in sympathy, but had the effect of holding him in the awkward slumped position. I'll have a warrant here in 5 minutes, Sylvia said. It's against the law. The prisoner turned to Joachim for affirmation, but all he got was the hand on the shoulder and more of the same expression he'd seen before. The look that said, now you've done it. Quaking with fear, he turned back to Sylvia. You're not going to stick that thing down my throat. Okay, Sylvia said, with just enough affability to convey, for a moment, a hint of reprieve. Then he added, down your throat, up the other end, all the same to me. Either way, we get the check. The suspect blanched and slumped back with resignation. By 6 o'clock, they had his signed confession, the wallpaper steamer had been returned to where Sylvia had found it, and the two detectives were back on the street. As time passed, their relationship with Captain Reese gradually improved, at least to the point where the early strain began to ease and both sides grudgingly accepted the fact that their fortunes were connected. The more the two night detectives continued to accumulate results, the more credit their efforts brought to the Major Crime Division and its captain. When things went well, Captain Reese generally left them alone. Although the relationship never reached a point that could be called cordial, when things didn't go well, however, it was a very different story. The best way they could hope for, they felt, was a kind of grudging neutrality in the benign neglect that seemed to follow their success. In fairness, both Sylvia and Joachim recognized that the problem was not all one-sided, and if the captain regarded them as upstarts and troublemakers, the two-nighters seldom went out of their way to prove him wrong. And the more Captain Reese criticized them for what they considered to be their strengths, the more they resented what they came to view as his corresponding deficiencies. They knew they were proving themselves to be extremely effective investigators. As their triumphs increased, their shared opinion of their captain's police skills correspondingly declined. Once, at the end of their shift, after Sylvia was interviewed on the radio in connection with an important case he and Joachim had helped to solve, Reese called them both into his office. Never mentioning their success, he berated them for a minor procedural omission related to the paperwork on the case. Our captain sure knows the book, Joachim said on the way out of the station house. Yeah, that makes up for a lot, Sylvia said. Never mind that he couldn't find a skunk in a phone booth. Not on a leash, Joachim agreed. Perhaps one reason the tension relaxed somewhat between the captain and his two troublesome detectives was that stresses on Reese were building from another quarter. In part, that new pressure began with